So, good morning, everyone. I want to talk about the film Virgin Punk Clockwork Girl. Like, I know I did a video about it a few days ago, and I want to give a shout out to James Hancock, Geeking with James Hancock, and because, he reviewed the film, and I understood what it was about a little bit more. And then also, I chose to see it twice. I chose to see it on Tuesday, and then I chose to see it, one more time yesterday, and I actually enjoyed the film a lot more. And I do want to talk about it, some of the controversies, and I also have my handy dandy notebook to quote Blue's Clues. So with Virgin Punk Clockwork Girl, it is a controversial film for, two reasons. Number one is that it's a 35-minute movie, and ultimately they do bait people in this film, which means that, you watch it and then, and then they try to make you want to stay and see the film or stay after seeing the film. But, it's just a 35-minute movie. Like, a lot of people are wise just to walk out of the movie after they showed the animated film. They were wise enough to walk out, really, because, the first 17 of the films is nothing but hyping anime conventions in, like, Texas, New York, and San Diego, I believe. And then you see the interview with Yasuomi Uematsu and a few other of his staff members. And then, 17 minutes later, you get into the movie. Like, when I first watched it, I was kind of like Homer Simpson. Start the movie. Start the movie. Start the movie. That's how I was. And then the other issue, too, is that I've talked about fatigue. Like, I'm a fan of professional wrestling, but there's something called fatigue. We all know that means tired, but that just means in a filmmaking term or in a filmmaking term, it just means that you watch something and it tires you because, like these interviews, it kind of tires you out, really, because 17 minutes is a long time. Every minute counts in filmmaking. To quote James Baldwin's book, Another Country, a minute is a very powerful thing. So you wait 17 minutes to see the actual film. And then also, during that duration, they show like these slides during the film, and it says, please stay, don't forget to stay over to see behind the scenes and whatever, really, So they give you double doses of behind the scenes. So the film plays at the 35-minute mark, and that's always, and then it starts, really. So that's the first controversy, that they should have just done this as a feature-length film, in my opinion. They should have, if there were like 6 or 7 parts, or maybe 10 parts, they should do something like say, hey, you know what, we're actually going to just show it all as one thing, really. Just like with Demon Slayer, like they did enough for 2 hours and 45 minutes. They didn't do something like say, oh, we're gonna make it a bunch of episodes, so it's gonna be, you're just watching episodes within a theater, really. And this is how I really felt, So I hope that, with part 2, it's like 90 minutes or feature length. And then the other thing that I want to say is that the other issue was the subject matter. Like, there were 2 big controversies with this film, that it is a rehashing of Kite, which is Yasuomi Uematsu's first film, his most famous work, his most controversial work. And it's controversial because it deals with a pedophilia, sexual assault type of relationship. And with my YouTube channel, I have no problem talking about that because, let's call for what it is. And I want to just mention that it really kind of goes down that line of free speech and also creating your work. And also what Yasuomi Uematsu said, that when he made Kite, the reason why I included, scenes of sexual assault, the reason why I did that was because it was supposed to, develop the character a lot more. It's almost like, with Jodie Foster in Taxi Driver. Like, there's this line by the man Sport, by her pimp Sport, saying, like, you can do anything to any part of her body, really. And they don't actually show it. The only thing that they do is they show her taking off her shirt, really. But then they said, oh, well, she had a twin sister, and it was a twin sister that happened in there. So sometimes how far do we take our character, take our story, take the depiction, and decide whether or not that's actually, exploitation, that's pornography, child pornography, or is that actual showing a character and what they've been through? Another great example is Lolita by Stanley Kubrick, because there is a lot of sexual innuendo in that film. I think like the main character, Humphrey, gives her a sandwich and says, "Oh, I know how you like with extra mayonnaise." You know, we all understand that that's, you know, a sex joke. So there's those two films, Taxi Driver and Lolita, where they talk about sexually abusive relationship on children, and they don't actually show a lot of graphic depiction. And then there's a film called Last Summer, and it's about a bunch of teenagers going to Block Island, and they have a really graphic rape sequence in that. They show a girl being pinned down, her her swimsuit bottoms are being removed, and, you know, there's a guy who's naked on top of her, and she's being sexually assaulted, really. And actually, if people don't remember, 1969, there were 4 X-rated films nominated for Oscars: The Wild Bunch, Midnight Cowboy, Last Summer, and Easy Rider. The first time Jack Nicholson was nominated for an Oscar, but Last Summer is the esoteric one. But there's 2 versions. There's the PG version where they don't show the sexual assault scene, and then there is the X-rated version where they show the sexual assault scene. And in my opinion, they didn't like show, the actors were over 18. They were playing teenagers, so it's not as bad because you're not showing actual underage people. And then the other thing about that is it really added to the film because it showed how bad you know, her sexual assault was, and the whole film was about like these teenagers being sociopathic, and part of their sociopathy was having a friendship with this girl that they sexually assaulted, really, because they dealt with sexual abuse and child abuse. So it's ultimately hurt people hurting people. So, you know, it's a more graphic depiction of underage sexual assault, but we always have the kind of, and it works for that film, really, and it wasn't exploitive or it wasn't pornographic. When you look at Kite, there's always like clips of it on the internet, you know, on adult websites and other things like that, and it's definitely more like a pornographic instead of just like a showing an actual rape or something like that, really, where you're trying to show that rape is horrible. Another film that is controversial that goes in this category is Pretty Baby, and Pretty Baby is with Brooke Shields, and what happens in that film is that Brooke Shields is playing a child prostitute in the 1800s when child prostitution was legal. The other controversy about the film is that she's 11 years old, she appears nude in that film, she's photographed. In the film, she has a relationship with a photographer that photographs her to show what it was really back then. I'm not seeing the entire film. I know I've seen summaries of it. There's some people who upload it on YouTube and clips of it as well, really. But really, really, it was one of those films that showed just like how bad it was. But there's also some controversy when it was filmed because when they were filming, what happened with Brooke Shields is that she would walk around the set naked all day because she was expected to do a bunch of nude scenes. And then what happened was one of the female crew members said, "No, we're not going to have this girl run around naked around all these actors. We have to, you know, she has to wear a robe and whatever." And they really just said this is not continuing until she wears a robe, because obviously, you know, it's not cute. It's very, very concerning. And you know, even like in porn films, you know, there's always actors walking around sets behind the scenes with robes. They're not walking around nude and whatever. So you're going to do this to an 11-year-old girl, you know, fuck the director for that. But these are like 4 examples of films that kind of remind me a little bit of the controversy around Virgin Punk and Kite. You know, when you want to talk about issues of sexual abuse on children or sexual predators, you know, where's that line between I want to show how bad it is, I want to show how it impacts the psychology of children, and where does it go into you know, exploitation? Where does it go into child pornography? And where does it go into shock value? Or where does it go into maybe the director wants to depict what they wanted to depict, really? So I'll talk about that a little bit later. But these are all very important talking points. So the movie takes place in the year 2099. So in that era, people have cybernetic implants. That's the same thing in Ghost in the Shell. You know, somebody moves their arm and then like guns and whatever, or their hand expands and they have like metal gears and parts to their bodies, really. So there's a girl called Ubu Kamagori, and she looks a lot like Sawa from Kite. And what happens is that she's at an orphanage that's also like a very fancy school for her to learn engineering. And then what happens is that the owner of the place, it's revealed that, you know what, he's had plastic surgery to hide his identity. And there's a bounty hunter named Mr. Elegance who has a bunch of dolls, and dolls are just these androids that are assassins. And then also dolls are also people who have their brains removed and put in these androids to do stuff, almost just very similar to Ghost in the Shell, really. And then the issue about Mr. Elegance is that he is very corrupt. He has a very strong Lolita complex, and he's very unapologetic about it. And I believe, if I'm correct, that there is a detective in Kite, and his name is Akai, if I'm correct. And I've not seen I've seen the censored version of Kite, but I've not seen the uncensored. And from what I remember, I believe he looks a lot like him. So you're doing character reincarnations, and it's kind of like that saying, "Why are you rehashing two characters in a very controversial movie about a sexual assault, a sexually abusive relationship, pedophile relationship, and also a how should I kind of say this, a Stockholm syndrome relationship?" So very controversial. So what happens is that he is that he hires her as an assassin, and what happens is that she works for him for like 10 years, and then she's 24 years old. And then what happens is that when she turns 24, he kills her, and then what happens is that he takes her brain and puts it in a cybernetic body, and he takes like her 24-year-old body and kills it with, like, I think hydrochloric acid, but hydrochloric acid is stomach acid, so you need something more potent. I think maybe it's sulfuric acid, but he takes her 24-year-old body, takes the brain out, puts it in a cybernetic body, takes her 24-year-old body, you know, just puts it in a drum, fills it up with like acid and everything like that. And then the issue is that, you know, her replica body is of her 16-year-old self, really. So he does, you know, unspeakable things. You know, he watches her shower. He has her dress up like a sex doll, and I believe, if I'm correct, he has her as a 24-year-old brain in a 16-year-old body, you know, in a 14-year-old body, that does prostitution or things like that, and also just for his, you know, sexual fancy, you know. So it kind of goes down that line too. Like, if you have another movie and they have a sex scene, you know, how do you process that? Because technically she is 24 years old with her brain and her maturity level, but she's in a body of a 16-year-old. So it kind of goes down to that controversy of, you know, is this a way for the director to kind of loophole a child porn or type of thing if he decides to have a sex scene between both these characters? But it's definitely evidential, or, you know, and it's also kind of like the other controversy too. Like, there's some people saying that for people who commit sexual assaults on children, maybe what we should do is invent dolls for them that are in the shape of children, just so they can, you know, get their energy out that way, you know. But obviously, you know, that's the controversy of this film, really. And it's also kind of controversial to say where they're going to take this next, really, because technically there are scenes of her naked. There's scenes of her like taking baths and whatever. And as we said, it's a 16-year-old. It's an android that's a replica of a 16-year-old. It's an android that's a replica of a 14-year-old. So technically, you're seeing a android that's naked in the form of a naked 14-year-old. And you're seeing this guy, Mr. Elegance, be like head over heels about that. And he also has the ability to shut her down, really. If she wants to fight him back, you know, he tries to shut her down and everything like that. So, you know, it's definitely just a little interesting, like how Masaomi Uematsu just keeps this storyline alive, really, of, you know, the pedophile and the assassin, really. And it's also a little like concerning how he skips the law with this, you know. And as I do say, like, I think like my ultimate question, I think, for everybody is, do you think that this is really him trying to see what he can get away with? Do you think this is Masaomi Uematsu just maybe having some, maybe he has a Lolita complex? Do you think that's also the case? or do you think that this is actually just a story about like sexual abuse and showing how bad it is? You know, like what do you make of it? And I think that in my opinion, quite honestly, I would say that I really think that quite honestly, this is really about shock value, pushing the envelope, seeing what he can get away with. You know, like just like what they do in Terrifier. Like in Terrifier, they had scenes where children were being killed. And you don't do that in horror films. And I believe, like in horror films, one of the other rules is that you don't do animal abuse. But I believe there was some animal abuse in that in Terrifier. And it was also not what was it? Not rated or unrated or NR not rated. So it was ultimately like, you know, like we can try to make this very violent as possible, but we can see what we can get away with a NR rating, really. So I really think with Yasuo Miyametsu, I really would say this. I think that generally with all the subject matter, it would be NC-17, quite honestly, really, because honestly, when you have a replica, an android that's a replica of a 14-year-old, and you have that nude, you automatically that automatically crosses a lot of lines, really. And I really say that I think it's a blessing that we don't have films like Pretty Baby anymore. Like there's also Madame Adolescenza, and there's also films in the 1930s where you would have children do skinny dipping and other things like that. You know, back then people thought that was cute and innocent, and then maybe in the 80s, you know, Brooke Shields was in Playboy and other things like that. So maybe people thought like, you know, children lingerie is kind of cute. You know, they want to be like adults really. But nowadays where there's more education to understand that that should be considered taboo and we should shun people, because sometimes that's allowing some people to get away with making adult content. And then the other thing too is that I work in a psychiatric ward. So, you know, I remember like one day there were like some kids screaming about how they were sexually abused and how their parents just didn't really care really, or how they were talking to their mom was laughing on the phone about how they were sexually abused. Like definitely sexual abuse is a very, very powerful thing. You know, we have to be very sensitive and mindful of the depictions that we have, and it cannot be exploitive, because then otherwise it's saying, okay, then it's more about trying to make those things what's the word, common without context, I would say. You know, like we don't want to just show fan service of characters or animated of actors that are real people or characters that are underage, because it creates more of it kind of says, okay, then where does it stop really? Where does it stop with sexual depiction or nude depiction of minors? And then also, where do we kind of draw the line in, well, people are trying to make points and other things like that. You know, like you really have to kind of say, okay, you know, a Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, you know, it made a point about sexual violence and how bad it is. When you look at shows like South Park, you've seen many nude characters in a lot of their shows really, but it's kind of like about shock value, but also satirizing like issues, you know, like how Cartman in Good Times with Weapons, he was walking across stage nude, and it was trying to talk about how, like, you know, sex and violence, you know, that those contents are both those contents, you know, like there's double standards with that. Now I got to go get my Subway really quick. Yeah, so my Subway order came and I had to go and, you know, get it and finish it. But I do want to say that I want to talk a little bit more about Virgin Punk Clockwork Girl. And there's two things I want to wrap this up with. That first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the psychology of people who experienced sexual abuse and Stockholm Syndrome, because I think it's also almost very important to this work. And I also want to say that before I get into that, I think like the animation and everything like that was done very well, really. Like I think that I'm always interested to see, like definitely the future films, yes, I would watch them because I'm just interested to see kind of where this goes, really. And I also like more edgy and more violent stuff, really. However, if it does get to a point where it's like more like sexual and more inappropriate, more like sexual and doing what they can with this, with Ubu within this body of a in the body of a 16-year-old, if they're trying to push more sexual stuff, then I would not be interested, because, you know, then it's ultimately like saying, okay, well, we're just about trying to what we can get away with like pedophile type of depictions, really. And then also too, I really just hope that Yasuo Miyametsu kind of understands that, you know, you have to be very, very sensitive when you have depictions of of minors and they're going through like sexually abusive relationships, because obviously it is sexually abusive in this one, because obviously you have Ubu, who is, you know, grows up as an assassin until she's 24. He takes the brain out of her body, and he takes her 24-year-old brain and puts it in a 16-year-old version of himself, because a 16-year-old version of her, because he's attracted to the 16-year-old version of her, really. And I'm sorry, because 16 is a very common number. I mean 14-year-old version of her. So definitely it's definitely do a sex scene in the next film between both of them. I really think then it goes down that line of, okay, well, you took it very far, really, because, you know, that's just not, because, you know, that's not okay. And then I also kind of wonder, you know, what messages, what psychological and emotional depth are you going to do with the characters. So I think that I'll be very interested to see what happens in the next film. And I think my other big concern is when they're going to do a next film, because I think they said they worked on this film for over 10 years. So this is going to be like once a decade type of thing, really. And then Yasuo Miyazaki, if I'm correct, he's in his 60s or in his 70s. So he also understands that he's going to croak, you know, so really soon. So we don't want to see this as an unfinished film, or he may just die one day and this may be like, oh, this is an unfinished masterpiece or whatever, really. In general, this work is not a masterpiece. I think that the animation is done well. You have a very edgy story, but that's a dime a dozen, really. You know, that's a dime a dozen. There's nothing really additional that it does to the genre. And this is just like a rehashing. This is just really Kite, Ghost in the Shell, and with a very high animation budget. That's all it is. So it doesn't, and I think, like, in honesty, you know, Yasuo Miyazaki, yes, he did push the line with Kite, and yes, a lot of people are inspired by that film because it was about crossing lines. But I don't think that he would go down in history. He's not going to be like Hideaki Anno with Neon Genesis Evangelion, or he's not going to be like the guy who did I forgot his name. The guy who did like Howl's Moving Castle, and a lot of all those other films. Like, he's not going to go down as one of the greatest anime directors in history. Like, he's not going to be on that Mount Rushmore. He doesn't deserve that because he's not created, you know, the like masterpieces that have, you know, transcended time, really. Maybe as one of the most controversial, absolutely, but not for a good controversy. The other thing I want to talk about is Stockholm Syndrome, because, and this is like a little personal too, that I do think that's also important to talk about sexual violence and depictions in film, really. Because I do want to say that, unfortunately, I grew up with sexual harassment, and I've also grew up with some inappropriate behavior happening to me. Like I mentioned in other videos, I had an issue with my dad slapping me on the ass and chuckling. I've had a brother who had mental health issues a few years older than me. So sometimes, you know, I remember when I was a kid, you know, whenever I showered and we shared a bedroom, you know, eyes were on me whenever the towel came off, really. And I also remember when I moved in with him after college, he had really inappropriate rules like no masturbation, or whenever I wanted to shower, he would just walk into the bathroom and use the bathroom or whatever, really. So I understand, you know, like I understand, like, you know, a little bit of sexual boundaries being violated, really. So I think that with Yasuo Miyazaki, I don't see anything in this where it kind of shows, there's nothing in this film that shows Ubu's character as somebody who is hurt by the sexual violence, is hurt by the exploitation, really. There's really no sense of, hey, this hurts me and this impacts my character. So it's just there to show how Mr. Elegant is a piece of shit, really. That's really what we're getting out of this. It's just that, really. And there are some stories where that's really the only message that you get out of it. Sometimes there are people who are pieces of shit, and the ultimate story is about, you know, whether or not that person gets a comeuppance or not. And sometimes you need films where they don't get a comeuppance, or you don't see how the character suffers, psychologically or a long drawn out meditation, really, because a lot of films do that, and you need to have something that's different. Like I was watching Requiem for a Phantom, and there's this character, I think his name is Scythe or whatever, and what happens in the film, what happens in that anime is that there's a scene where he's about to get killed, and then the person that he has been torturing, you know, it goes in reverse. She actually dies and he actually lives. But it's good that they have that because it shows that, you know, sometimes, you know, pieces of shit, you know, make it to old age and die, really. You know, and I've known many people like that in my life, but, you know, that's true, really. So it is a controversial movie, but I would say that it's also cheap in a way because he's really just taking what he did in Kite and mixed it with Ghost in the Shell with a really great animation budget. So I really just hope that people understand when they watch this, that this is just somebody who's really a master of maybe pushing, maybe just repeating how he pushes the envelope instead of, you know, being somebody different, really. Like, you look at Quentin Tarantino films, like, you know, definitely Kill Bill was way more violent than Pulp Fiction, and Quentin Tarantino, you know, he did Django Unchained, where he used the N-word over 400 times, and then he's experimented with different genres where people may say, oh, it doesn't have the same quality as his other films, you know. So I think that, you know, quite honestly, Quentin Tarantino's a better director with a long career of doing different shocking things. Or you look at Stanley Kubrick, you know, he made a lot of very controversial films and very powerful films, but he wasn't always repeating the same controversy in every film that he did, really, you know. So I really think that there's a lot of talking points to Virgin Punk, Clockwork Girl, and that's even a funny name. Virgin's a controversial name, punk, cyberpunk, Clockwork Girl, Clockwork Orange. So, you know, it's interesting. But yeah, that's how I feel about it. You know, it's definitely a controversial film, and I really think it does aim on it's a very controversial film, but it does aim on repeating the same controversies in addition to being 35 minutes and people being tricked into thinking it's a full-length movie.